but you could say there's something in me going on and on. But in that going on and on, there's something very, very young in me looking for, the perfect response. All right. So, yeah, welcome everybody. The mad, more wild than mad psychotherapists are kind of at it again. So tonight we're going to just have a think around a question and then how to help people with that kind of complication in their lives. But the question is, when people go on and on and on about something,
Hmm.
and it might be in a relationship where one member of the relationship goes on and on and on, and in a nagging sort of way. And it might be male nagging or female nagging, but there's a kind of going on, and they, won't stop, but it tends to kind of trigger the other person in the relationship to go and get activated, and then between the two of them, it escalates. And usually one of them, usually the person that's being nagged at or got at and criticized, gets triggered in a very primitive way, and they go into anger and ranting and raving. Maybe becomes violent, maybe bangs walls, doors, but or maybe they go into flight. They might, leave the house. There's a kind of an activation where both of them are in a position where they're not really able to talk about something because they're both triggered, both activated. My question to myself was, aren't they both in some ways dissociating and splitting in a way that they're no longer in their central headquarters self? They're in a kind of another state of emotional dysregulation that is causing them to almost like be a problem to themselves and each other.
So why would you think of it as dissociation? And how are you using that term? Because I think of it in a somewhat different way.
Well, dissociation is a question. Well, it's kind of like dissociation and splitting. They're going into another subtle realm of dysregulation where there's a kind of energy field there that's not their normal, self energy field. It's a regression
Hmm.
into a place that's got, because of the distress or the stress, that they're no longer, just in relationship with themselves. They're in a blinded relationship with this activation and this theme that they're going on and on about. And the other person is triggered in a way that a lot of their historical, maybe for both of them, their historical disappointments, hurts, trauma is lit up and floods forwards and totally takes over, so they become possessed by that complex, that the anger, the ranting and the raving, the globalized thinking, globalized talking, always, never, here we go again. And they're both doing a bit of the here we go again, and they're both into globalized thinking and
Hmm.
speaking.
Hmm. Right at the end there, you talked about complexes. And of course, more from a Jungian point of view, that's how I think of it
Mm.
as being taken by a complex. And it's not clear that people understand what Jung was saying when he talked about complexes. But I tend to think of complexes just as he would say, like split off parts of the self. And then you've got various different actual psychotherapies talk about them in different ways. Some of them will call it parts, and there'll be a certain part which carries emotions and experiences. Some people will talk about it in terms of false self, true self. I tend to use complexes because when I'm doing EMDR, it actually makes sense that when you go into one of these experiences, say a person has this almost obsessive and compulsive way of stuckness in their thinking and in their behavior, they're taken, as you say, they're taken by this energy field, which has captured them, has captured their identity, has captured, and I should say captured my identity because I can identify with this. So, say for instance, I don't know, something upsets me and I get angry, I will find myself saying the same things, being critical, thinking in a particular pattern. And I know that that's not me, quotes, in terms of Jung would be saying your true self, your full self. It's a part self which has contains a lot of energy which has never been resolved.
Mm.
And it's trying in that situation two things. One is to change the outcome, but the other is also to discharge that energy, that excess energy. But it's doing it in a way which is has failed in the past and continues to fail in the present. So I
Making.
tend to think of it very close to a recurring dream.
Mm.
Because recurring dreams are very interesting. Why would you have a dream about something in the same way again and again? Well, it's very like those waking experiences when we do the same thing again and again, because the unconscious is both brilliant and pretty stupid. So it's trying to give you a message about something, but it keeps giving you the message in the same way, which you didn't get the first time. And bigger picture for me is like failures of self-awareness, failures of being in ourself. Yes, we're conscious at that time, but are we self-aware?
Mm.
Yes, I'm conscious of what I'm doing, but I'm not in charge of it, and I can't monitor it fully to recognize that it's not actually having the desired outcome. So I know those are just some of my thoughts as you're trying to, but I think of it as an attempt to discharge which has goes circular, that goes round and round and has that compulsive quality. That's the one person. The problem is when you have a couple,
Mm.
the couple in some sense unconsciously has decided to get into this pattern and are unable to get out of it because one will trigger the other, which one triggers the other. It's a feed forward loop. It's no feedback loop. So one person triggers the other, which escalates the other, and so it goes up and up.
Well, I like the idea of feeding feed forward loops and escalations, and also that it's repetitive, like a dream is wanting to be understood in a way that allows
Hmm.
a way out of that loop. I often think about it in relation to the infinity sign. If things are flowing in a way that's going around the two loops, then it's a kind of like a healthy, clean system that's developmental.
Mm.
Room for awareness in that. But if anybody gets looping in one of those ends, it just is then like locked into a repetition compulsion almost.
Right, right.
But I often think about domestic violence is like living in a constant state of disconnect and fear, where in some ways the past has come into the present for both those people in a way that it's almost like they need either one of them to do something different that'll make a difference, or they need an external authority or others to kind of become involved in a way that helps them see that there are complexes at work in that, and a great unhappiness and sadness that
Mm.
almost like they're alone with something that they both have already suffered hugely from developmentally, probably, as well as in that fix that they're in within the relationship.
Do you think that one of the elements in it is the wish to be seen, the wish to be recognized and validated, and that there's going to be somewhere in the past a failure of being recognized, of being seen? And so what you have is this desperate attempt to be seen, to be heard, to be recognized. But it's packaged in a way which makes it almost impossible for the other person to actually see it or see beyond the aggression or beyond the emotionality of it. You know, you talk a lot about babies, but the way a baby looks up at the mother with
Mm,
that kind of adoring look
mm,
and the eye contact. It's always saying to me, "See me, see me. I am here. I
mm,
am.
mm,
I'm not sure what me means, but I am me, and I need to be seen.
mm,
Otherwise, I don't know if I exist or not."
mhm. It's like a mirroring needs to happen that's got a kind of developmental quality of freshness, aliveness, and stimulation within it. It needs to have stimulation in order to keep being developmental because it's longing for new information all the time
Mm.
and manageable doses. In this kind of going on and the escalation, I think there is a disappointment and a want, for something to be different, to get out of that pattern. But I think it's got such early roots in a way that you could say both people, the one who rants and raves and the one who goes on and on, that they're both like babies crying. You could forget about the words and there's just wow, wow, wow. There's just a wow, wow. And it's
But
become
it is also the thrashing, you could say it's like the thrashing and the screaming and the crying. The problem is that when you're an adult and you do that, it's very destructive.
yeah, you've got all these words and they're
Hmm.
usually pretty repetitive, but they're still like crying really. But I mean, it's very interesting helping adults like be there if it's just about an individual
Hmm.
getting triggered. If I was just working, seeing one of those people, it would be about trying to help them see, the regression, the split and the regression that goes on, but also in the flooding of the past, as you say, the huge energy that floods forwards from the past that then becomes blinding. That's a kind it's like there's two babies and there's no adult all of a sudden.
Right. And that's when I'm talking about, you're talking about dissociation, and I would say it's kind of a loss of self-awareness, a
Mm,
loss of self-monitoring, or the ability to even know what you're experiencing or how you're coming across. Because self-awareness to me has two aspects. I know what's going on inside me,
mhm,
but I also have a pretty clear sense, even if it's going to be distorted, of how you experience me.
mhm,
If I don't know how you experience me, then of course my self-awareness has kind of lost some aspect of it.
mhm,
Now, we never actually know how other people experience us because, first of all, we don't even know the sound of our own voice, and we can be startled by hearing it and even startled by seeing ourselves on camera. How does that other person see me, recognize me, and experience me? And is that in some sense the same as what I'm experiencing myself as? If there's the split, as you say, that other person is not experiencing me as I experience me. They're experiencing somebody else. And
mhm,
I keep trying to get them in the same way, which is useless, to experience me and what's important for me. They're seeing maybe through their own lens or they're seeing through their own triggeredness. And
mhm,
so there's this failure of connection, as you say.
mhm. You could relate that to an individual in terms of their own, whether they're in relationship with themselves or out of relationship with themselves.
Mm, hmm.
These two kind of affected beings. So there's the flooding. It doesn't allow you to kind of be in a place of your achieving self that is trying to be with whatever's happening, that the energy of the situation has kind of captured both people, both parts of the self, the central
Mm,
headquarters self, and the kind of the part that's been activated and is regressing and is overwhelmed. Like it just everybody becomes overwhelmed. I think that in one way, it's the only way that complexes can come to us is by overwhelming us to some extent. Like you can even think of boredom, like lots of mind states or emotional states, capture us all the time in funny little ways. Whether it's monotony, boredom, exuberance, it might be going into a sort of judging, blaming mind, or it might be guilt, possessiveness about something that's happened in the past or recently. So there's a kind of a non-differentiation between the kind of achieving self, that loss of a kind of relationship with your higher self, between your higher self and your lower self, and both become, in some ways, pulled down to the lower self position and even lower. There's no capacity to be with something very well and developmentally. If I try to think about things that trigger me, and if I try to think about looking forward to the next occasion instead of dreading it, and to see it as an opportunity to actually be there for myself differently in relation to that flooding that I experience. And it's hard because, as you say, your field of functioning narrows when you're triggered. And so you're kind of like in it and constricted, and a frozenness or a constriction, I call it, because it's like you can't function fully in that narrow field.
The aspects when you've got somebody who's a nagger and then you've got somebody who's explosive is very much the kind of the pursuer and the avoider, and that's a very common dynamic in all couples, I think. Every couple, in some sense, have that part where one person wants to be closer and the other person wants to be somewhat more distant, and that couples have to negotiate and work through that issue. It's very fundamental to our attachment styles because if one person has got an anxious attachment style, they're always going to be pursuing, they're going to be nagging. And if the other has got a much more distant or avoidant style, they're always going to be backing off.
Mm,
Neither of them is going to feel as though they can find a middle ground which is comfortable.
mm,
But the other part, which I was thinking about when you were talking, which is that nagging sometimes has a underlying desire for closeness, even
mm,
though it pushes the other person away.
yeah, it's a longing to be understood and heard in a way, and for there to be a better harmonious working together, cooperation.
And you could say the distancer has a longing for space in order to be able to process things because they're slow. And they get overwhelmed quickly. So they have a longing for a little more time, a little more space, so they can kind of settle into themselves, but they get flooded very easily. And then the best way to get a person to back off is to attack them.
Mm,
And anger is getting rid of the person and pushing them as far away as possible. And fear is often actually sometimes clinging to them,
mm,
or it can be ambivalent, like I cling and then I get overwhelmed. So,
mm, mm.
so what should a couple do? How do you help a couple who get into these kind of patterns and dilemmas?
Somebody has to change their relationship, or part of myself has to change my relationship with the pattern of what goes on. So my achieving self is the one. In family therapy, they say it's the person with the most power, that in terms of, I would say, the most integration, that needs to be, taking the one who's trying to kind of bring about a change in the quality of the relationship, have an intention, first of all, to go about that pattern differently and create it, and appreciate that there is a history of a bit of addiction to that other pattern for one reason or another. And so it'll take time, to change that pattern by going about that differently with myself, but also feeling like the central headquarters me is the one that should be in charge of the younger, more regressed position of defiance or anger towards somebody, or just don't care, or a downward pull towards an area of poor self-esteem, or historical position of, not feeling good about myself. So when my achieving self says, I know you're there, that I will manage this, I will cope with this. It's my job as the achieving self. It's not, if you, and I welcome you flooding me. but I look forward to the next occasion of being flooded
Uh,
by that. So there's initially, there's my my mature achieving self goes offline, but not completely, and so if I get more and more accustomed to kind of pulling it back online and putting it back in the center and saying to the little guy, this is not your job, it's okay. These feelings, I know they come from lots of places in the past that have
mm,
been hard, and there's been a lot of suffering, and it's okay. I know you need to come again and again. These things are going to happen, but each time, I will try to work with it and meet you in that in a way that's more like us growing up together rather than us getting divided against each other.
yeah.
That's,
So the first thing I think when you were talking, which is that when you have the couple in the room, is the problem or the pattern has to be named. It has to become the center of both of everybody's attention. It has to be in the middle. So we've got this pattern. You nag, he explodes. You nag, he explodes. You nag, he explodes. So do you want to change that? And usually the couple want to change that, but it has to be centered in the room, like this is what is actually happening, and you want to change it. So then there's an intention. Okay, so what have you tried and what have you failed at?
mm,
And then, as you say, you're trying to engage those parts of the person. You have a way of talking about that self. What would you call the achieving self? I haven't come across that.
yeah.
Yeah, I would call it more the true self, false self, true self. That's simpler for me. You want to get that part which is more self-aware involved, and
Mhm,
then you want to do this thing where you move from what I call towards love, from tolerance first. First of all, I'm going to have to tolerate this because it's not going to go away.
mhm,
Then I've got to accept that it's actually going to happen. So there's an acceptance piece. And then we work towards understanding what's going on. And only with understanding can we get to the place where we actually experience it as not a problem and start to create more loving connection with each other. So I always
mhm,
think of it as a kind of a process which needs to happen between the couple, but maybe in each
mhm.
individual.
Yeah, I think appreciation of them as a couple and as individuals, like in what they have achieved in their lives, what they've been through in their lives, and how, in spite of that, they have found each other. And there's this a want for something to happen or to keep happening, that is a growing and learning and loving relationship. And there are stuck places within that have occurred because of that it's almost like they haven't been able to be there for each other. I think there's a kind of need to take care of people when they come in a way that there's a real valuing of they want a lot to change in their lives. That is, but they don't know what that is yet, but
Mm.
they've been recruited into a limited way of being in the world through socialization, hard knocks along the way, and they have a lot of fears and anxieties. So there's something about communication, of making therapy a place where communication can flow more easily and not have judgments around it to do with right and wrong, but to try to in some way facilitate more communication. And as a therapist, to be a part of what makes us human,
Mm.
commonality we all share, that they may be different from me in degree, but they're not different in kind. And I might even be worse off in some ways than some of their kind of patterns.
I don't know if I ever told you this story, but I used to see couples fairly infrequently. And I don't think I was very good at it. And so there was this couple, and they came to see me. I'd seen them, it's about third session in. He was very rich, he very successful, The kind of client who will actually answer his phone during sessions, which is pretty annoying. And his wife was pregnant. And they just kind of what you were talking about. She was nagging him about his work and being on the phone, and he was being aggressive with her and dismissive. And it was just going on. And I was sitting there thinking, this is horrible.
Mm,
And I made a very lame intervention, which is I said, I don't think I'm helping you. And they said, that's right. And they got up and they walked out. I did not see a couple again for 10 years. With that couple who taught me so much by leaving, I felt that it was impossible to change. And I
mm,
suppose if you look back, I'd have to say it's that same feeling as the child I had when my parents fought. And
mm,
I have images of them fighting. And I
mhm,
have images of me as a child watching them fight
mm,
and not being able to do anything about it.
mhm.
So I think that's another dimension for
Yeah.
us as therapists when you see that dynamic with your couple, how easy it is to get triggered yourself and the counter transference that you get in those situations.
Mm, mhm. Yeah. No, I think that's really helpful because it's we learn a lot from our failures in a sense. I don't know if I call them failures as I would the stuck places we experience with couples or individuals. And there's a lot to kind of then go away and think about and maybe even learn about in terms of studying. I think it's just good to think how we all get divided against ourselves and we get into a place that is not a happy place, in our mood states or our thinking and feeling states. And when that's in relationship, it gets really more tangled, more complex because it's almost puts us on a collision course with other people, unless unless there's some kind of process of turn taking, of making it not being an argument, but being a process of turn taking and sharing, what you're feeling or your response to the other person, but it doesn't get into interrupting each other and into a kind of escalation. It stays, in quite a calm, more spacious sharing space, of
Right.
relationship.
That reminds me of something which I think I say to most couples, which is that I had this client and she came to see me and she had this amazing dream. And in the dream, she met the Holy Spirit, and he was actually dressed like a mechanic in a kind of garage because that was his job. And he said, yeah, I look like this, but I'm really the Holy Spirit. As the Holy Spirit was leaving, he turns around and he says to her, because she'd been divorced twice. She says, you can have a good relationship.
Mm,
And she goes, no, I can't. I'm too difficult to live with. And the Holy Spirit said, everyone is difficult to live with.
mm,
And I
mm,
thought was so perfect. I love
yeah,
that. It was just such a gift from my client.
powerful.
Everyone, I'm very difficult to live with. You're difficult to live with. Every single person who watches this is difficult to live with. We start from that baseline and then we work from there.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a good story. And I just one other thing I want to say is the word nagging I don't like, but I use it. I would say continuing to do something, going on and on in any way in a negative pattern. I forget to turn lights off. My wife gets on at me about that, and it triggers me the way she does that. But you could say there's something in me going on and on, but in that going on and on, there's something very, very young in me looking for, the perfect response. And so we have a little routine now where my wife reacts and says, "You left the lights on again. Why do you do that?" And I'll say, "Could you say that nicely, please?" And she'll say, "John, could you turn the lights off, please?" And I'll say, "Without sarcasm, please, without
Yeah.
cynicism." And she'll say, "Could you turn the lights off, John? Try to remember." And I'll say, "Oh, that's just right." It's like the Goldilocks effect of of just right, not too hot, not too cold, just right. Yeah. And there's something really important about negotiating, that process between us. And
Yeah, and that's to do with maturity in relationship, isn't it? Which
mm,
is maturity in relationship, which is that you've had 1,000 opportunities for things to go wrong, and
mhm.
gradually over the years, you've found ways to go round them or to solve them or for them to be not important.
It's good to think that everything is process of trying to get close enough in your differences that there's room for that difference in degree, but not in total kind of lopsidedness.
What are you left with?
Well, I think the word dissociation isn't quite right. So it makes me think of the window of tolerance model, in that narrow field that you were drawing attention to. So I'm left with thinking, well, in order for that to happen, there is a kind of uh, going out of relationship with oneself fully, properly into a somewhat dissociated state where you're in a different, I don't know, it feels like you're in a different cloud of being than your normal state, and it's not a kind of easy one to orientate within
Mm.
towards what's right. There's room for a lot of confusion and grasping or aversion. So yeah, so I want to think more about that. And I like the processes of trying to just bring awareness to more of what's going on, using what's going on, within relationships in a way that helps people just join in a shared inquiry about what's this about, where does this come from, and for us to kind of just dig a bit deeper together into understanding, what's getting in the way of a better relationship. So
Mm.
yeah, what
So I'm
about
left
you?
with a few things. One is that I'm always left with the sense that relationships, particularly intimate relationships, are probably the most difficult thing we will ever do in our whole life. And they're the longest lasting, and they have so many opportunities to go wrong that it's almost a miracle that it ever goes right. So that's what
Mm,
I'm left with. But I like when you were talking about the sign, the infinity sign.
mm,
That actually struck a chord with me, which is that the movement, thinking of the movement of energy, it comes into me, I process it, I then send it back to you, you process it, and then you send it back to me. But it's got a smooth kind of channeling. And if we're circling separately rather than doing this, we are just banging each other. We kind of bang up against each other. So I like that. I like that sense, which is that there has to be this process of movement inside, back outside. And when you get these difficulties, it's all outside because
mm,
the person's lost the sense of I'm processing what is actually happening to me and what's going on. So I really like that actually as an image. And you could use that as an image of all relationships because let's face it, life is all relationship. There is nothing but relationship.
mm, mm.